John McMullen going to join us here on a Sports Bash Friday. He'll give you his pick for the game. 5 on the Vikings right now at 97.3 ESPN.com. Eagles at practice today. A couple of key names out, but what's the status for the weekend? We'll get John's update on that in just a short moment. Also, you look at Sam Bradford coming back to town, as John writes over at 97.3 ESPN.com. Bradford reflecting on his time in Philadelphia, John, and I kind of want to start there with Sam Bradford. I feel like this week is a lot different than it would have been had the Eagles been struggling in terms of record-wise. Yes, they're struggling entering this game at 3-2, but I feel like because Wentz was kind of a big story for a couple of weeks in the NFL, it has kind of downplayed this reunion of such. You know, it's kind of unique that this guy was just here 6-7 weeks ago, was the guy, and now he's coming in here and you're playing against him. But I do feel like there is, that storyline has not been a big one.
Well, I think it's bigger nationally than it is locally. I think everybody's played it down from the head coach to the players themselves, Carson and Sam. Both head coaches, the familiarity aspect, everybody's played down. And I think one of the reasons why is because there's no ill will. Sam doesn't dislike the Eagles, has a lot of friends here. And from the same standpoint, the Eagles had a lot of respect for how Sam handled himself while he was here. So there's no angst from either side. So I think locally it's not as big as a deal as it might have been. If you take, for instance, immediately after the draft, you remember when Sam had his little temper tantrum and left OTAs for a couple of days. I think at that point, if there was something that came out of that, and there was some ill will between Sam Bradford and Carson Wentz, I think it would have been played up. But the two got along, and they got along well, and they like each other. So a lot of that anger and that fuels a rivalry is not really there.
Yeah, and, I guess Sam has handled it pretty well considering you got to have a little bit of a bruised ego being traded, twice within, a year, right? I mean, that's not something that everybody gets excited about.
No, yeah. I mean, I think Sam looks at it in a couple ways. I think he's much more comfortable in the Midwest. I think he knows this is obviously the best supporting cast he's ever been around. So from a professional standpoint, he's pretty happy. He's second in the NFL in passer rating. He leads the league in completion percentage. So he's really putting his name back into that conversation of being a legitimate NFL starter moving forward. So I think from a professional standpoint, he's happy. And from a personal standpoint, as I said, he's still got a lot of friends, particularly Jordan Matthews and Zach Ertz, who really have a ton of respect for Sam and are very, very friendly with him. He still has a lot of people he likes in that locker room. But I think the one aspect that people hit the nail on the head on, Sam didn't like it here. He's not an East Coast guy. He didn't enjoy the area that much. But that has nothing to do with the Eagles or anything of that nature. So I think ultimately, while he was shocked, I think he's happier.
John McMullen's with us, 97.3 ESPN.com. He's got a piece up about Bradford. Bradford's got 6 touchdowns, no interceptions. You would look at those numbers and say, well, he's playing really well. Do the numbers tell the story of Sam in Minnesota?
Yeah, they do. If anything, he's played better because they've had so much issues on the offensive line. He's really masked a lot of those deficiencies. They haven't run the football at all. They're averaging 2.5 yards a carry. Both offensive tackles are injured and on injured reserve. He's been under siege at times, but he's been able to get the ball out of his hands quickly, and he's developed a rapport with a very underrated receiving corps. A lot of names that people might not know but are really good players. And he's playing as well as you can imagine. I mean, anytime you play 4 games and don't turn the football over, in this league, that's pretty good. So from the Eagles standpoint, I think there's some thought that, hey, it can't go on forever, and let's be the first to make this team make mistakes and see how they handle that.
You touched on some of the injuries that Minnesota's had, John. I did a little looking up on the Genie box, and 10 players on injured reserve. How both offensive side of the ball, defensive side of the ball, they've had guys be out. How have they been able to be successful when other teams seem to lose one or two weapons and they struggle?
Yeah, it's amazing offensively. I mean, they're not great offensively. That's where they've lost most of their people, starting with the quarterback, obviously, and they had to make the trade to replace Teddy Bridgewater. So that's worked out. They lost Adrian Peterson. They lost both of their tackles. And that's usually a death knell to any offense. We saw the Eagles struggle losing Lane Johnson. A couple reasons for it. The tackles they lost aren't as good as a Lane Johnson level player. They weren't playing all that well to begin with. And the backups aren't as bad as a player like Vaitai, so it's a lot closer. And some people have argued, specifically Jeremiah Sirles playing right tackle for the Vikings. He's better. He has been better than Andre Smith. And TJ Clemmings playing left tackle. Well, he hasn't been good. He's probably got a higher ceiling. He's a very young player, very talented player than Matt Khalil. So the one thing about the Vikings is they're really, really deep, and that's a rarity in today's NFL. And that's why they've been able to overcome some of these issues. But I guarantee you they wouldn't have been 5-0 if they didn't make the trade with the Eagles.
And then we talk about offense and defense, but you look last week, the Eagles' points all came off of special teams. Don't overlook the special teams.
Yeah, and that's the weird thing.
On either side.
Usually the Eagles go into just about every game with a big special teams advantage, but that's not necessarily the case this week because, hey, the Vikings, they have the best kick returner I've ever seen in Cordero Patterson, and I mean ever in the history of this game. And their punt returner, Marcus Sherrills, already has 2 touchdowns this year. He's got 5 in his career. He's very Darren Sproles-like as far as quickness, and he's a small guy. So they're really good on special teams as well. The one advantage the Eagles will have, though, is their kickers are not great. Blair Walsh at one time was an all-pro, but ever since that missed kick in the playoffs, it's obviously affected him mentally. He's not the same, and they have a pretty weak punter. So if you're looking for something, Donnie Jones and Caleb Sturgis certainly have the advantage over those two guys.
Talking with John McMullen here, Eagles and Vikings. A couple injury news. Slot situation. What if Ron Brooks can't go? I think that's kind of an undervalued. He's been an undervalued player on that defense, not because he's been great, but because what happens if he's out?
Yeah, it's a bad week for him to be out against Minnesota. Malcolm Jenkins is the backup plan, and Malcolm's played well in the slot before, but Malcolm is a different type of slot player in the fact that he could handle, for instance, if he were handling a Jordan Matthews type in the slot, he would generally do a very good job. But when you have small, quick guys, the Cole Beasley types, he can't handle that type of player. Minnesota's got 2 of them. We'll see if Stephon Diggs is back on the field. He's questionable, but he's had the bye week, had the groin injury. If he's there, that's a really, really difficult matchup because the Vikings put him in the slot, usually on third downs. But even if he doesn't, they have a kid named Adam Thielen, who a lot of people don't know, but he's a really good player. And that's going to be a difficult matchup because he's a similar type wide receiver that he's got tremendous short area quickness, and that's what Malcolm tends to struggle with. So the Eagles really need Ron Brooks this week.
Now, John, Benny Logan hasn't practiced all week, right? I think he's still listed as questionable. What does he have to do to be able to play on Sunday, and what's the impact if he doesn't?
Well, Doug says he's going to give it a go and see how he feels with the groin. He's questionable, hasn't practiced all week, as you mentioned. I would be stunned if he played. And I don't think it's a necessity in this game because, as I said, Minnesota doesn't run the ball well. I guess from the Eagles' standpoint, they kind of understand they need a significant pass rush from the front four. And obviously, Benny is better equipped to do that than Bo Allen. But as I said, I would be wary of trying to push him back because groins are sort of like hamstrings and they can turn into nagging things. And I think, Benny, if you look forward and you look at the Dallas Cowboys in that running game, I think it's more important to have him at 100% or as close to 100% if you can get him on the field for that game.
The penalties have been a discussion for the last few weeks now, John, and I know Doug talked about the penalties. How does he go about fixing that from a coaching perspective?
Yeah, I mean, you talk about it in meetings, you talk about it in practice, and you try to drill it into guys' heads. Some of it is, let's be honest, though, and I think the Eagles kind of understand this, they're not as worried about it as other people seem to be. This is a home game. The realization of the NFL is, hey, you're probably going to get a few more calls at home than on the road. So I think that alone is going to take it a tick down from the enormous numbers they've had over the past couple of weeks. And I just think they're looking at it at this point as sort of an anomaly. But, you know, Doug talked about you have to press it in meetings. You have to make people clear. Certainly, as a player, you have to understand how a particular game is being called. And if you see in the first quarter that there's going to be a ton of flags and they're throwing them and that particular crew is having a bad day, so to speak, you have to adjust to it. And I'm not sure how much you can do, but they'll reinforce it time and time again in practice and then meetings.
John McMullen's with us. He did mention Barber kind of banged up, but he expects him to play. Also, Kelce, plantar fasciitis, and he talked about him, and he said Wiz would be the guy. But the plantar fasciitis for Kelce is interesting. Sal Pal brought this up, and you're pushing off that foot. And if you're having problems with the foot, we already know he's a little, a lighter center. So now to have a foot problem as well, I mean, is this something that Peterson thinks they're going to have to keep an eye on? Would Wiz, potentially be a factor in this game if Kelce's struggling?
Yeah, he could be. I mean, if the pain becomes too much, I mean, and this is just if Jason was completely healthy, this is just a bad week for him because Linval Joseph is standing there, and that's one of those guys who's just, we had Teron Davenport on earlier in the week, and he called him the strongest player in the NFL. I mean, in a phone booth, Jason's going to get beat up healthy in this game. And that's what teams have been doing to him. So it's really, really difficult. But for people to assume you're going to put Stefan Wisniewski in there and say it's going to get better, I mean, he's not going to be able to handle a player like that either. So you just do what you can, sort of like Connor Barwin against Trent Williams last week. It's not a good matchup. And you try to, put your finger in the dam as much as you can, I guess. It's just a bad week for Jason, and that injury makes it even worse. But long term, yeah, I mean, we've seen that injury in not just football, but in different sports. That could be a big, big issue, and it's very, very painful injury. So it is something you have to keep an eye on.
Well, I will say this, John, real quick, that if Wisniewski comes in and plays well, I already know what the Daily News headline will be. It'll be Wiz Wit.
I don't think you have to worry about it. I think one of the things, because we all talked about, it's becoming increasingly clear to me that the Eagles aren't as high on Stefan Wisniewski as the rest of us are. You talk to people behind the scenes, and I think Isaac Seumalo is kind of out of the conversation ever since he had that pec injury. He was originally in line to start at left guard. Once Lane Johnson got suspended, sort of took a big step back because of that injury. I think long term, the Eagles' plan is for Isaac Seumalo to be their next center.
So now that let's go to wide receiver for a second. Now that wide receiver Dorial GreenBeckham's been here for an extended period of time, and Frank Reich said that there are no limitations with him as far as the playbook goes, do you think Doug sees him not only as a starter but a WR1?
No, not yet. He certainly sees him as a starter, though. I mean, last week he equaled Nelson Aguilar's reps in the game. So the Eagles have been using 11 personnel, which is 3 wide receivers as their base offensive package. So basically, Jordan Matthews, Nelson Aguilar, and Dorial GreenBeckham are all starters. And a guy who's really taken a hit as far as playing time goes is Brent Selleck. That might change this week, though, because if you look at the Vikings front 7, the Eagles might, because of the problems Vaitai had, they might want to give him a little more help coming into the game instead of adjusting during the game. And that could mean more 2 tight end sets. So I think the receivers, their playing time might scale back a little bit this week, and Brent Selleck might be on the field a little bit more.
Hey, John, I opened up the show talking about, when you look at Doug and Andy, there's a lot of parallels. The one thing that Doug doesn't seem to have is Brian Westbrook. He was like the dependable guy. You need 60 yards rushing, you need 40 yards receiving, vice versa. Even though he didn't have great wide receiver weapons, Westbrook was always the guy that kind of bailed them out. And then when I'm thinking about this team through 5 games, that's what's lacking? Is it that they don't have an identity at running back?
Yeah, I think it's a problem. This running back by committee thing is not working. I don't have an issue with it when you don't have one guy that you can point to and say, that's going to be my bell cow. Obviously, the Eagles don't have Ezekiel Elliott, so they have to make do. And I am disappointed in the way Ryan Matthews has played this season, whether it's due to the concussion he had last year or the ankle injury, whatever the reason is. He hasn't performed up to his usual standards. But when you talk about running back by committee, what that means to me is you get a feel in a game for who's having the best outing, and then you sort of hitch your wagon to that guy on that particular day. The Eagles, they haven't done that. Last week, a couple weeks ago, they cut it down to pretty much just Sproles and Matthews. That didn't work in Detroit. Last week, it was the 4 running backs again. And it's sort of like you can't get a feel for the game. You can't get in the flow of the game for any of the backs. You have to have one guy who's at least getting the majority of the carries and try to get a running game going. And I think that's very, very important against Minnesota, because if they don't have a running game and they become one-dimensional, they just don't have a chance against this team.
Yeah, you'd like to see it, maybe the league get back to that. I mean, you saw down in Minnesota, Ajayi, basically, he had been a nobody. They featured him last week. He goes for 200 yards. I mean, some of these guys, they're used to touching the ball, high school, college, just about every single time that they get to the league, and it's so sparse when they're going to get this playing time. I'd like to see the league kind of get back to, hey, you're going to be our guy, you're going to touch the ball, and maybe we begin to go back in that direction. It seems like trends come back around. But, all right, John's with us here, a lot of NFL stuff. John, let's get your pick for Eagles-Vikings Sunday. Are the Vikings due for that off day?
I mean, it's going to come at some point, so why not the Eagles? But the best way I describe it is, if Minnesota brings their A game, the Eagles don't have a chance. So what you have to hope is they have a bad day and you play well. And I think there's a possibility of that happening. But with that defense and the consistency it's had, it's number 1 in 16 different categories as we speak today. I can't, in good conscience, pick the Eagles. But I do think it's going to be close. I do think they're going to be in it in the fourth quarter. Because I don't think Minnesota's offense is explosive enough, and I have the Vikings winning a 21-16 game.
21-16 for John as they, of course, kick off right here on 97.3 ESPN Sunday at 1. John will be there and back on Monday with his reactions on a Eagles-Vikings matchup. John, enjoy the game. Skol.
Skol to you too as well. Thanks, guys.